In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a Cuban Mojo style roast pork, and it's vegan and gluten-free. Hey, if you're new here, welcome. And if you've been a viewer of this channel for a long time, hello again. It's nice to see you. This channel is all about gluten-free and vegan foods. I show you recipes to make that are both gluten-free and vegan, and I give you ideas about products that you can buy that are gluten-free and vegan. And I also do occasional videos about locations, particularly restaurants, that you can visit that offer gluten-free and vegan-friendly foods. So most roast porks have a fat cap on it. That's one side that is coated with a layer of fat on top of the actual muscle or meat. And that adds a richness and a moisture to the roast pork. So I had to create one for this particular recipe, and I'll show you how to do it. So when I say mojo style, this roast pork, both within the actual recipe for the pork roast and then the sauce, it's going to have a citrus forward focus, also including the layering of garlic as a flavor enhancer. So it just ends up being a delicious garlicky and citrusy roast pork. So in my recent roast pork video, that recipe was for a savory pork, and this takes that flavor profile to the next level, making it mojo Cuban style. But the recipe for the actual pork also has developed since my prior recipe. You may want to watch that video to see what I did there. That actually was a first-hand account of me experimenting making that roast pork. This one as well is my first attempt at this version, but I've modified it from the prior version. I've changed up the ratio of some of the chickpea and pea protein, and then I did something different with the mushrooms that I've added, and certainly the flavor profile changes. And then adding the pork cap is a totally different level to this particular version. So I want to remind you, being a gluten-free recipe and a vegan recipe, I'm not using seitan and I'm not using methyl cellulose, which is used in so many commercial meat substitutes, or faux meats, if you will. So let me get on to showing you what I did and how I made this recipe. I started with 8 ounces of trumpet mushroom stems, and then also 8 ounces of baby portobello mushrooms. I thoroughly washed all of these and dried them, and then I put them in a food processor separately by type, and then I pulsed them to small bits. I didn't make it into a mush or a paste. I just chopped them up into smaller bits. I then set those aside in a separate medium-sized bowl. Then I put a medium-sized skillet onto the stove and added 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and I brought this up to heat, and then I splashed some water on to test whether or not the oil was hot, and I added the mushrooms, stirred that around to coat all of the mushrooms, and I added a bit of salt. And then I sauteed these for about 5 to 7 minutes to reduce the mushrooms a bit, draw out some of the water, and just dry them out a bit. Next, to a large bowl, I added 3/4 cup of chickpea flour and 1/3 cup of pea protein isolate, and 3 tablespoons of potato starch, and 1.5 tablespoons of tapioca starch, and 1 tablespoon nutritional yeast, 1 teaspoon each of garlic powder and onion powder, 1/2 teaspoon of smoked paprika, 3/4 teaspoon cumin, 3/4 teaspoon dried oregano, and 1/2 teaspoon black pepper. I then mixed all of these dry ingredients together to combine them. In a separate medium-sized bowl, I then added 1 1/4 cups of vegetable broth, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of melted refined coconut oil, and 2 tablespoons of melted cocoa butter, and 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. I then added 3 tablespoons of fresh squeezed orange juice, 2 tablespoons of fresh squeezed lime juice, and 4 cloves of crushed garlic. I also added about 1 teaspoon of salt to the wet mixture, and then I stirred everything together to combine it. I allowed the mushrooms to cool for a bit, and then I added those to the dry mixture. And then I folded everything together to combine the mushrooms within the dry mixture. Next, I added the wet ingredients to this combination of mushroom and dry mixture, and I stirred that all together to combine everything. The batter was too liquidy, so I added an additional 2 tablespoons of chickpea flour, an additional tablespoon of the pea protein, and 2 extra teaspoons of the tapioca starch. I will leave the final written recipe with all amounts in a PDF that you can obtain by sending me an email that I will put in the description below. I allowed this dough to rest then while I moved on to making an agar mixture. To a saucepan, I added 1/2 cup of water and 1 tablespoon of agar powder, and I brought this to a boil, and then I turned it down slightly and simmered it for about 3 minutes and continuously stirring so that everything dissolved and that the agar then gelled. You have to move quickly. I then took that agar mixture and I folded it into the dough and mixed it around really well to make sure the entire dough got some of the agar mixture. I then set the dough aside to rest for 10 minutes. I then took a large square of aluminum foil and I placed it on the counter, and on top of that I then placed a big piece of parchment paper, and I started loading the dough onto the parchment paper. Now, I made 1 large loaf. You can make 2 separate loaves, smaller loaves, because this does make a very large loaf. So what I did was I shaped it into, like I said, a loaf shape, and then I took the parchment paper and I wrapped it around the loaf. The dough is quite soft, so you just have to make sure that when you're wrapping it around the parchment paper, you are forming still a loaf and that things don't seep out the sides. And then I covered it with the parchment paper and then wrapped up the foil around that parchment paper. I actually ended up adding an extra layer of foil around the initial foil. I then cinched the edges shut. And then created a steamer basket by placing a large strainer over a large pot of boiling water. I then placed the foil wrapped loaf in the steamer basket, and I put a lid on it, and I steamed it for about 45 minutes, and then I flipped the loaf and steamed it for another 45 minutes. During this whole time, you want to check your water level to make sure that it's high enough and that it's just slightly simmering. You don't want a rolling boil. After it simmered for the full 90 minutes, I then took the loaf out of the steamer basket and I placed it on the counter to cool for, I think it was at least an hour. I then unwrapped the loaf, I dried it off with some paper towel, and then I wrapped it in plastic wrap and stored it in the refrigerator overnight. You don't want to skip the storing in the refrigerator overnight, because what it does is it helps the agar mixture set. If you're enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you give the thumbs up, and please share it with those who may need gluten-free and vegan foods. Also, if you aren't a subscriber, consider subscribing so that you get notifications about upcoming videos that focus on gluten-free and vegan recipe ideas, products, and restaurants. On the same day that I made the roast pork dough, I also made the mojo sauce. For this, I diced 5 cloves of garlic. Then to a saucepan, I added 1 cup of freshly squeezed orange juice and 1/2 cup of freshly squeezed lime juice. To the juices, I then added 2 tablespoons of olive oil and 1/2 cup of vegetable broth, I then added the minced garlic cloves. I then added 2 teaspoons of cumin, 2 teaspoons of oregano, and 1 teaspoon of smoked paprika, as well as a teaspoon of salt and a half a teaspoon of black pepper. I gave the sauce a taste test and I decided it needed about a teaspoon of sugar, so I added that to brighten it up a bit. And then I stirred everything together and I simmered it for about 10 minutes and then I allowed it to cool and I placed it in the refrigerator for overnight. To make the pork fat cap, I added 1 full can, that's a 15-ounce can of full fat coconut milk to a saucepan, and then I added 1 cup of white rice flour and 1 cup of tapioca starch, and then 1 1/3 cups of water and a pinch of salt. And then I stirred this all together, and you just need to keep heating this and stirring it, and it will thicken into a almost like a thick pasty dough. I allowed this to cool and then wrapped it in plastic wrap and stored it overnight in the refrigerator. The next day, I took the roast and the fat cap dough out of the refrigerator. I let them come to room temperature for maybe 30 minutes. The roast was quite firm, but still had a nice softness to it. And the dough, it firmed up, but what I did was I took that and I put it between some plastic wrap, and then I rolled it out to a long rectangular shape to fit the size of the roast. So I put the roast on top of the dough and I started wrapping it around the entire roast. Now you can just put it on half if you like, because actual fat cap on pork is only on one side of the roast. But anyway, I had enough and I put it around the entire roast. The dough is pliable, so you can stretch and pull it around the roast. And I actually then wet my hands with some water to smooth out certain cracks and to seal the edges. To give the roast a, quote, crispy skin, I used rice paper. I softened the rice paper wraps, and then I put 2 on one side, flipped it over, put 2 on the other, and then I did the process again, 2 on each side. So a total of 8 wraps, and I smoothed out the rice paper to make sure everything was well sealed. And then I took the mojo sauce and I used a basting brush, and I put the roast in a casserole dish and I brushed the exterior of the roast with the mojo sauce to add some flavor. And I also then added some salt and pepper to the exterior of the roast. I baked it in a 400-degree Fahrenheit oven for 30 minutes. At about the 15-minute point, I took the roast out of the oven. I put some extra of the mojo sauce on it with a basting brush, and then I flipped it over and I put the mojo sauce on the other side as well. Then I put the roast back in the oven to bake for the additional 15 minutes, again for a total of 30 minutes. Then I turned up the oven to broil, and I put the roast under the broiler, and I broiled it on each side. That's 4 sides for about 3 to 5 minutes per side to give this crispy exterior. I placed the roast on a cutting board and allowed it to rest for some time. I think it was about 20-30 minutes. I wanted it to cool down a bit so that the slicing would be easy, so that it wouldn't be too soft when I sliced it. I served the roast with black beans and rice, and I poured over that delicious garlicky, citrusy mojo sauce. The pork interior is, in comparison to my last pork roast, this is very moist, it's tender, and the fat cap adds a layer of succulence, and it's a bit indulgent, but again, it's not actually fat, so it's just a delicious addition, and then the crispy skin adds another layer of enjoyment. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about the recipe that I've made, I'm going to actually leave my email in the description below. You can email me for a printed copy. It'll be a PDF of the particular recipe. But if you have questions about, certain methods that I'm using or how to do certain things, just please feel free to email me. I'm happy to respond. And in fact, I love hearing from you. If you have other recipe ideas that you would like converted into a gluten-free and vegan recipe, please send me an email. And also, since I referenced my prior pork video, check out this video because it does cover my initial endeavor here with a roast pork.